Look, I need you to think about every single interaction you have ever had with law enforcement. Not just the traffic stops, but the casual conversations at the airport, the friendly chats when they walk through the train, even that moment when an officer approaches you because you fit a description of someone they're looking for. I want you to think about how those conversations made you feel, that slight flutter in your chest, the immediate need to explain yourself, the overwhelming urge to prove you're a good person who follows the rules. Now, I'm going to ask you something, and I really want you to think about this before you scroll down to the comments section to share your thoughts. Have you ever walked away from a conversation with a police officer and spent the rest of the day replaying it in your head, wondering if you said too much, if you accidentally admitted to something you didn't do, or if that friendly officer was actually gathering information that could be used against you? I want you to pause right now and type yes in the comments if you've ever had that sick feeling after a police conversation. And if you've never thought twice about it, I need you to tell me why you trust that everything you said was harmless. Because here's the truth that most travelers and everyday citizens don't understand until it's way too late. The American legal system is not designed to protect you when you're talking to police. It's designed to gather evidence. And the officers you're speaking to? They've been trained for months, sometimes years, in the art of extracting information from people who don't realize they're being extracted from. This isn't about police being bad people. Most of them are just doing their jobs. But their job is to solve crimes. And if you become part of an investigation, even accidentally, that friendly conversation becomes a tool. Stick with me here, because I'm about to walk you through something that most people never hear about until they're sitting in a courtroom wondering how their casual answer to a simple question turned into Exhibit A. I've spent years studying travel law, police procedure, and the real experiences of people who thought they were just being cooperative. What I'm going to share with you comes from hours of conversations with defense attorneys, former police officers who now teach people how to avoid the traps they used to set, and travelers who learn these lessons the hard way. And I'm going to tell you about 3 specific questions, 3 seemingly innocent, friendly questions that you should never, ever answer, no matter how polite the officer seems, no matter how much you want to help, no matter how confident you are that you haven't done anything wrong. Let me start with something that might surprise you. The most dangerous questions aren't the ones that sound accusatory. They're not the aggressive, "Where were you last night?" or "What's in this bag?" types of questions. Those put you on guard. Those make you think about your rights. No, the truly dangerous questions are the ones that sound like casual conversation. They're the ones that disarm you, that make you forget you're talking to someone with the power to arrest you, that trick you into thinking you're just having a normal chat with another person who happens to be wearing a badge. And the first of these questions, the one that gets more people into trouble than almost anything else, is so simple it almost hurts to think about. Where are you coming from? Think about how many times you've been asked that question today alone. Your coworker asked it when you walked in. Your neighbor asked it when you got home. Your friends ask it all the time. It's the most natural, normal, completely innocent question in the world, and that's exactly why it's so dangerous when a police officer asks it. I remember talking to a guy named Marcus who learned this lesson at the Phoenix airport. He was coming back from a weekend trip to visit his brother in Tucson. Just a quick flight, nothing unusual. As he was walking through the terminal toward baggage claim, a police officer stopped him and asked if he had a minute to talk. Marcus, being a cooperative person who'd never been in trouble in his life, said sure. The officer was incredibly friendly. He smiled, asked Marcus how his flight was, asked if he'd had a good trip. Then, almost as an afterthought, he asked where Marcus was coming from. Marcus said Tucson. The officer nodded, made a little note, and asked what he'd been doing there. Marcus said visiting his brother. The officer smiled again, thanked him for his time, and sent him on his way. Marcus thought nothing of it. He actually felt good about the interaction, like he'd been a helpful citizen. 3 weeks later, 2 detectives showed up at his door. A woman had been robbed at gunpoint in the Phoenix airport parking garage during the exact time window when Marcus was walking to baggage claim. The victim described the suspect as a black male, roughly Marcus's height and build. And here's the problem. Marcus had told the officer at the airport that he was coming from Tucson, but he couldn't prove it because he'd paid cash for his ticket, and his brother wasn't exactly the type to keep detailed records. The officer's report noted that Marcus seemed cooperative but nervous, and that he'd volunteered his travel itinerary without being asked for proof. It took Marcus 3 months and $15,000 in legal fees to convince the detectives that he wasn't their guy, all because he answered a friendly question from a friendly officer who was just doing his job. But here's the thing that really gets me about this question. When an officer asks where you're coming from, they're not just making conversation. They're establishing what lawyers call timeline evidence. They're creating a record of your movements that can be checked against witnesses, surveillance footage, and other evidence. And if there's any discrepancy, if you say you were at a restaurant but the credit card receipt shows you were somewhere else, if you say you were alone but someone places you with another person, if you say you were coming from one place but the direction you're walking suggests another, that discrepancy becomes evidence. Not evidence that you did something wrong necessarily, but evidence that you might be lying. And once an officer believes you're lying about something small, they start wondering what else you might be lying about. I want you to understand something about how police training works. Officers are taught to ask open-ended questions and then just listen. They're taught that most people hate silence, that if they just wait long enough, the person they're talking to will fill that silence with information. So, when an officer asks where you're coming from, they're not just listening to the answer. They're watching how you answer. They're noting whether you make eye contact. They're observing if your story changes when you tell it a second time. They're paying attention to whether you give too many details or not enough. And all of that goes into a mental file that eventually becomes a police report, that eventually becomes testimony in court. Now, let me ask you something else. How many of you have ever been pulled over while driving and had the officer ask, "Do you know why I pulled you over?" Raise your hand in your mind if that question has ever come out of an officer's mouth during a traffic stop. Because that's our second question, and it might be the most brilliant trap in all of law enforcement. Think about the psychology of this question for a moment. An officer walks up to your window, and instead of telling you why they stopped you, they ask if you know. Immediately, your brain starts racing through every possible mistake you might have made. Was I speeding? Did I roll through that stop sign? Is my tail light out? Did I forget to signal? And in that moment of panic, you want to be honest. You want to show the officer that you're a good person who makes mistakes, but owns up to them. So you say something like, "Yeah, officer, I know I was going a little fast back there. I'm running late for a meeting, and I just wasn't paying attention." Congratulations, you just admitted to speeding. You just gave the officer probable cause to write you a ticket, or worse, to start investigating whether you might be impaired or distracted or anything else that could escalate this stop. And here's the kicker. You admitted to something before the officer even told you what they thought you did. What if they pulled you over because your registration is expired, not because you were speeding? What if they pulled you over because you have a tail light out, something you genuinely didn't know about? By admitting to speeding, you've now given them a reason to cite you for something they might not have even noticed. I talked to a defense attorney in Atlanta who handled a case that still makes me shake my head. A woman was driving home from a work dinner, hadn't had anything to drink except water, was completely sober and alert. She got pulled over for what the officer later claimed was erratic driving, weaving within her lane. When the officer asked if she knew why he pulled her over, she said, "I think I might have been drifting a little. I'm tired. It's been a long day." That admission of fatigue, combined with the officer's observation of weaving, gave him enough justification to ask her to do field sobriety tests. She agreed because she had nothing to hide. She failed some of the tests, not because she was impaired, but because field sobriety tests are designed to be difficult even for sober people, especially when you're nervous and it's dark and there's a police car with flashing lights behind you. The officer arrested her for DUI. It took 6 months and a lot of money to fight that charge. And it all started because she answered a simple question honestly. The smart response to this question is so simple that it feels almost rude. You just say, "No, officer, I don't know why you pulled me over. Can you tell me?" And then you stop talking. You don't speculate, you don't apologize, you don't explain, you just wait for the officer to tell you what they observed. Because here's the thing, the burden is on them to articulate why they stopped you. That's how the Fourth Amendment works. They need reasonable suspicion or probable cause to initiate that stop. By asking you if you know why, they're trying to get you to do their job for them, to provide the justification they need to continue the investigation. And this brings me to something really important that most people don't understand about traffic stops. The initial stop is just the beginning. Once an officer has pulled you over, they're allowed to ask questions, but you're allowed to not answer. The Supreme Court has made it clear that traffic stops are seizures under the Fourth Amendment, but they're relatively brief seizures. The officer can ask for your license and registration, and you have to provide those. But beyond that, you have the right to remain silent. The problem is that most people don't know this, or they're too afraid to exercise that right because they think it makes them look guilty. Now, the third question is the one that really gets under my skin because it sounds so genuinely friendly, so concerned, so helpful. It's the question that officers ask with a slight furrow in their brow, with a tone of genuine worry in their voice. Is there anything in the car I should know about? Think about how that question is phrased. It's not accusatory, it's not demanding, it's almost protective. The officer is essentially saying, "Hey, I'm here to help you. If there's something that might cause a problem, just tell me now and we can work it out." And in that moment, if you have something in your car that you shouldn't have, a joint from last weekend, a pocket knife that's technically illegal in your state, an open container you forgot to throw away, you might think it's better to be honest. You might think the officer will appreciate your honesty and let it slide. Let me tell you about a couple from Colorado who learned this lesson the hard way. They were driving to the airport to catch a flight to Cancun for their 10th anniversary. They were excited, a little stressed about making their flight, and they got pulled over for speeding. The officer was incredibly friendly. He asked about their trip, wished them a happy anniversary, and then, almost as an afterthought, asked if there was anything in the car he should know about. The husband, wanting to be completely honest, mentioned that there might be a roach clip in the center console from a camping trip a few weeks ago. He said it was just a clip, no weed, just the clip itself. The officer asked if he could take a look, and the husband, still thinking this was a friendly interaction, said sure. The officer found the clip, found a tiny amount of residue in the console that he said tested positive for THC, and suddenly a speeding ticket turned into a drug possession charge. They missed their flight. They missed their anniversary trip. They spent thousands of dollars on a lawyer. All because the husband answered a question that sounded like it came from a concerned friend rather than a law enforcement officer. But here's the part that really bothers me about this question. Even if you have nothing illegal in your car, even if you're completely clean, answering this question can still get you into trouble. Because once you say no, you've made a statement. And if the officer later finds anything, and I mean anything, that they think might be suspicious, your no becomes evidence that you lied. Maybe it's a legal prescription bottle that the officer thinks looks suspicious. Maybe it's a tool that could be considered burglary tools if the officer decides to interpret it that way. Maybe it's just a water bottle that the officer claims smelled like alcohol. If you said there was nothing to know about, and the officer finds something they can spin as questionable, your credibility is shot. I remember a case from Florida where a guy was pulled over for a broken taillight. The officer asked if there was anything in the car he should know about. The driver said no. The officer asked if he could search the car. The driver, confident he had nothing to hide, said yes. The officer found a legal firearm in the glove compartment, perfectly legal to own, perfectly legal to transport in Florida. But because the driver had said there was nothing to know about, the officer claimed the driver had been deceptive. That deception became part of the justification for a more thorough search, which turned up nothing else illegal. But the driver spent hours on the side of the road, while the officer called in the firearm serial number and ran background checks and generally made the guy's life miserable. Now, I need you to understand something about how these questions work together. They're not random. They're not just whatever pops into the officer's head. They're part of a system, a methodology that's taught in police academies across the country. Officers learn to start with broad, open-ended questions that get you talking. Then they narrow in based on your responses. They're trained to look for inconsistencies, for nervousness, for anything that deviates from what they consider normal behavior. And once they find something, they pull on that thread until either they're satisfied you're clean or they have enough to escalate the situation. Let me give you an example of how this plays out in real time. An officer pulls you over, friendly smile, casual demeanor. "Hey there, how's your evening going?" That's not a real question. That's an icebreaker. They're watching how you respond. Are you relaxed? Are you tense? Do you make eye contact? Then comes the first trap. Do you know why I pulled you over? If you bite, if you start speculating, they've got you talking. Then, while you're explaining yourself, they're looking around your car. They're shining their flashlight in the back seat. They're noting the fast food wrappers, the gym bag, the air freshener hanging from the rearview mirror. Then comes the second question, usually phrased as casually as possible. "So where are you headed tonight?" Now they're building a timeline. And finally, if they haven't found anything yet, they'll ask the third question with genuine concern in their voice. "Listen, is there anything in the car I should know about? Any weapons, drugs, anything that might be a problem? I'm asking because if there's something, it's better to tell me now than for me to find it later." And here's the cruel irony of this situation. The people who are most likely to answer these questions honestly are the people who have the least to fear. They're the ones who've never been in trouble, who believe in the system, who think that cooperation and honesty will be rewarded. And sometimes they are rewarded, with a warning instead of a ticket, with a friendly goodbye instead of an arrest. But sometimes they're rewarded with a court date, because the system doesn't distinguish between honest cooperation and incriminating evidence. It just takes whatever you give it and uses it however it can. I want to share something with you that I learned from a retired police officer who now teaches classes on police interaction. He told me that the biggest mistake people make is treating police encounters like normal conversations. In a normal conversation, when someone asks you a question, you answer it. That's how conversations work. You ask, I answer, we both feel good about the interaction. But a police encounter isn't a normal conversation. It's an evidence-gathering operation disguised as a conversation. The officer isn't trying to get to know you. They're trying to figure out if you've committed a crime, and every word you say becomes data that feeds into that analysis. This retired officer told me something that stuck with me. He said, when I was on the force, I could tell within 30 seconds whether someone was going to talk themselves into trouble. It was the people who couldn't stop talking, who felt the need to fill every silence, who wanted me to like them. Those were the people who ended up saying things they shouldn't have said. And the sad part was, most of them hadn't done anything wrong. They just didn't know when to stop. Think about that for a moment. The people who haven't done anything wrong are often the most vulnerable because they don't have the natural caution that comes from experience with the system. They haven't learned that good people can get into trouble too. They haven't learned that the Constitution exists to protect everyone, not just people who've been arrested before. They haven't learned that the right to remain silent isn't just for criminals, it's for everyone. Now, I need to address something that's probably going through your mind right now. You might be thinking, but what if I'm completely innocent? What if I have nothing to hide? Why shouldn't I just answer their questions and get it over with? I understand that thinking. I really do. It's natural to want to cooperate, to be helpful, to demonstrate your innocence through openness and honesty. But here's what I need you to understand. Your innocence doesn't protect you from being misinterpreted. Your honesty doesn't protect you from having your words twisted. Your cooperation doesn't guarantee that the officer will see things the same way you do. I've sat in courtrooms and watched people try to explain themselves. I've seen juries listen to testimony that sounded perfectly reasonable to the person giving it, but sounded completely different when filtered through the prosecution's questions. I've seen innocent people convicted based largely on their own words they offered freely because they thought they had nothing to hide. The legal system isn't designed to interpret your statements in the most favorable light. It's designed to test them, to probe them, to find the weaknesses in them. And when you're the one making the statements, you're also the one providing the rope that might be used to hang you. Let me give you a real example from the airport, because this is where a lot of travelers get into trouble without even realizing it. You're going through security, you've got your shoes off, your laptop out, your liquids in a clear bag. A TSA officer asks you a question about something in your bag. You answer. Then a police officer who's standing nearby overhears your answer and walks over. He's friendly. He asks where you're flying today. You tell him. He asks if you're traveling for business or pleasure. You tell him. He asks if you packed your own bags. You say yes. He asks if anyone gave you anything to carry. You say no. He smiles, thanks you, and walks away. You think nothing of it. But what you don't know is that the drug-sniffing dog that walked past your bag 5 minutes ago gave a subtle alert that wasn't strong enough for probable cause, but was strong enough for the officer to want to talk to you. What you don't know is that the officer was gathering information to see if your story matched what they observed. What you don't know is that everything you said is now in a report, and if the dog eventually gets a stronger alert, or if something else happens, those casual answers become part of the evidence against you. This isn't about paranoia. This isn't about assuming every officer is out to get you. This is about understanding how the system actually works and protecting yourself accordingly. The vast majority of police officers are decent people doing a difficult job, but their job isn't to protect you from the legal system. Their job is to enforce the law, and that sometimes means gathering evidence against people who haven't done anything wrong yet but might have, or who the officer suspects might have, or who just happen to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. I want to talk about something that rarely gets mentioned in discussions about police encounters, and that's the role of body language and tone. When an officer asks you these friendly questions, they're not just listening to your words. They're watching everything. They're noting whether you cross your arms or keep them open. They're observing whether you lean away or stand your ground. They're tracking your eye movements, your breathing rate, your perspiration. All of this goes into what they call behavioral analysis. And here's the problem. Normal nervousness looks a lot like deceptive nervousness. Most people get nervous when talking to police, even when they've done nothing wrong. That nervousness can be misinterpreted as guilt, and that misinterpretation can lead to more questions, more suspicion, and ultimately, more trouble. I remember talking to a young woman who was stopped at the Atlanta airport because she fit the description of someone the police were looking for. She was 22 years old, flying home to see her parents, had never been in trouble in her life. When the officer approached her and asked where she was coming from, she got nervous. Not because she'd done anything wrong, but because she was a young woman, alone in an airport being approached by a police officer. Her voice shook a little. She avoided eye contact because she was scared. She stumbled over her words. The officer, trained to see these as signs of deception, kept asking questions. He asked where she'd been. She said visiting a friend. He asked the friend's name. She gave it. He asked what they'd done. She said they'd gone to some clubs. He asked if she'd had anything to drink. She said a little. Now he's thinking about DUI, even though she's not driving. He asks if she's carrying anything she shouldn't be. She says no. He asks if he can search her bag. She says yes because she's scared and wants to prove she's not hiding anything. He searches, finds nothing, thanks her, and leaves. On the surface, this story has a happy ending. Nothing was found, nothing happened. But here's what that young woman didn't know. The officer made a report. In that report, he noted that she was nervous, that she avoided eye contact, that her story changed slightly when he asked follow-up questions. That report now exists. If anything ever happens, if she's ever identified in connection with any crime, that report becomes part of the picture. It's not evidence of guilt, but it's evidence that an officer once found her behavior suspicious, and that can be used to suggest a pattern. Now, I need to be clear about something. I'm not telling you to be rude to police officers. I'm not telling you to refuse to identify yourself when you're driving. I'm not telling you to resist lawful orders. What I'm telling you is that you have rights, and exercising those rights doesn't make you a bad person or a guilty person. The Constitution exists precisely because the founders understood that people need protection from the power of the state, even when they've done nothing wrong. The right to remain silent isn't a loophole for criminals. It's a fundamental protection for everyone. Let me give you a script for how to handle these questions when they come up. It might feel awkward at first, but it's worth practicing until it feels natural. When an officer asks where you're coming from, you can say, "Officer, I appreciate your questions, but I've been advised by legal counsel to politely decline to answer questions without an attorney present." That's it. You don't need to explain further. You don't need to justify. You just state it clearly and calmly. When an officer asks if you know why they pulled you over, you say, "No, officer. Can you tell me why you stopped me?" When an officer asks if there's anything they should know about, you say, "I'm not going to answer any questions about the contents of my vehicle, officer." And here's the most important part. After you say these things, you stop talking. You don't fill the silence. You don't explain why you're not answering. You don't try to be helpful in other ways. You just stop. The officer might push back. They might say things like, "Why won't you answer? Do you have something to hide?" You don't answer that either. You just repeat, "I'm not going to answer questions without an attorney present." You can say it 100 times if you need to. You can say it until they give up. I know this feels uncomfortable. I know it goes against every social instinct we have. We're raised to be polite, to answer questions, to cooperate with authority. But here's what I need you to understand. The people who wrote the Bill of Rights understood that authority needs to be checked. They understood that even well-intentioned authority can become dangerous if it's not balanced by individual rights. They gave us the Fifth Amendment not because they expected us to need it every day, but because they knew that sometimes, in some situations, we would need it desperately. Let me tell you about a man I met named David. David is a retired airline pilot, someone who spent 40 years traveling the world, someone who's been through more security checkpoints and police interactions than most people will experience in a lifetime. He told me that for the first 35 years of his career, he answered every question police officers asked him. He thought of himself as a cooperative citizen, a representative of his airline, someone who should set a good example. Then, about 5 years before he retired, he got pulled over for speeding in a state he was just passing through. The officer was friendly, they chatted. David answered all the questions. And when the officer asked if there was anything in the car he should know about, David said no, because there wasn't. The officer asked if he could take a look. David, still thinking this was a friendly interaction, said sure. The officer found a small bag of marijuana in the glove compartment that David didn't even know was there, later determined to have been left by his grandson who'd borrowed the car the week before. David spent the night in jail. He had to hire a lawyer. He had to explain to his airline why he'd been arrested. The charges were eventually dropped, but the damage was done. He missed flights. He spent money he shouldn't have had to spend, and he learned a lesson he wishes he'd learned decades earlier. David told me something that I think about a lot. He said, I spent 40 years trusting that if I was honest and cooperative, everything would work out. And for 39 of those years, it did. But that 40th year taught me that it only takes one time, one officer, one misunderstanding to change everything. I wish someone had told me sooner that being polite doesn't mean you have to answer every question. This is why I'm so passionate about sharing this information with travelers. When you're in an airport, you're in a unique legal environment. You're on federal property. You're subject to federal jurisdiction. You're dealing with multiple layers of law enforcement, TSA, airport police, sometimes FBI, sometimes Homeland Security, and you're often tired, stressed, running late, not thinking clearly. This combination of factors makes travelers particularly vulnerable to friendly questioning that can have serious consequences. Think about what it's like to be in an airport. You've probably been up since 4 a.m. You've wrestled your bags through check-in. You've taken off your shoes, your belt, your jacket. You've stood in line for 45 minutes. You're dehydrated. You're caffeined up. You're thinking about your connecting flight, about the meeting you have when you land, about whether you remembered to pack your phone charger. You're not thinking about your constitutional rights. You're not thinking about the long-term implications of answering a few simple questions. You just want to get through this interaction and get to your gate. And that's exactly when these questions are most dangerous. That's when you're most likely to say something you don't mean, to admit to something that isn't true, to volunteer information that creates problems you never anticipated. The friendly officer knows this. They're trained to recognize fatigue, stress, distraction. They know that people in airports are often at their most vulnerable, and they use that knowledge, not necessarily maliciously, but effectively. I want to share something else with you that most travelers don't know. The TSA and airport police share information. If a TSA officer flags you for something, even something minor, even something that turns out to be nothing, that information can be passed along. So when a police officer approaches you after you've been through security, they might already have information about you that you don't know they have. They might be asking questions to confirm or challenge what the TSA officer noted, and your answers, combined with whatever the TSA officer observed, create a picture that can follow you through the airport and beyond. This is why I always tell people to be particularly careful at airport security. Don't joke about bombs. Don't make comments about your bag being suspicious. Don't say things like, I hope this doesn't set off the alarm, or you're not going to find anything, I hope. Those comments, even when meant as jokes, even when said with a smile, go into the record. They become part of the interaction. And if anything else happens, if there's any reason for further scrutiny, those comments can be used to suggest that you knew something, that you were nervous, that you had reason to be concerned. Now let me bring this back to the 3 questions and give you some practical strategies for dealing with them in different situations. Because the way you handle these questions at a traffic stop is different from how you handle them at the airport, which is different from how you handle them if you're stopped on the street. At a traffic stop, you have certain obligations. You have to provide your license, registration, and proof of insurance. You have to identify yourself. Beyond that, you have the right to remain silent. So when the officer asks if you know why you were pulled over, you say, "No, officer, can you tell me?" When they ask where you're going, you say, "Officer, I'm not going to answer questions about my destination." When they ask if there's anything in the car they should know about, you say, "I'm not going to answer that question." And if they push, you say, "I'm exercising my right to remain silent, and I'd like to speak to an attorney if I'm not free to leave." At the airport, you're in a different situation. You're on federal property, and the rules are slightly different. TSA officers can ask questions about your baggage, and you generally have to answer those questions if you want to get through security. But once you're past security, once you're in the concourse, you're back to the standard rules. If a police officer approaches you and asks friendly questions, you can politely decline to answer. You can say, "Officer, I'm trying to catch my flight. Is there something specific I can help you with?" If they don't have a specific reason to detain you, they'll usually let you go. If they do have a reason, they'll tell you, and then you can decide whether to answer or to ask for an attorney. On the street, if you're stopped by police, the first question you should ask is, "Am I free to leave?" If they say yes, leave. Don't hang around answering questions. If they say no, you're being detained, then you say, "I'm going to remain silent, and I'd like to speak to an attorney." You don't answer any questions, not even friendly ones, not even ones that seem completely harmless. I know this sounds extreme. I know it sounds like I'm telling you to be paranoid and uncooperative, but I'm not. I'm telling you to be smart. I'm telling you to protect yourself. I'm telling you that the Constitution gives you rights for a reason, and exercising those rights isn't uncooperative. It's just smart. Let me tell you about one more case because I think it illustrates why this matters so much. A few years ago, a guy named Michael was flying from New York to Los Angeles for a job interview. He was excited, nervous, wanted to make a good impression. At JFK, he was approached by a police officer who asked if he had a minute to talk. Michael, wanting to be helpful, said sure. The officer asked where he was flying. Michael told him. The officer asked what he did for work. Michael told him. The officer asked if he'd ever been to Los Angeles before. Michael said yes a few times. The officer asked if he knew anyone in Los Angeles. Michael said he had some friends there. The officer thanked him and let him go. Michael thought nothing of it. He flew to LA, did his interview, got the job, moved across the country. A year later, he got a call from a detective. There had been a series of thefts at JFK around the time Michael was there, and someone had identified Michael as possibly being involved. The detective had a report from that officer noting that Michael had been cooperative but vague about his reasons for traveling to LA. Michael was able to prove he'd been at a job interview, that he'd gotten the job, that he had no connection to the thefts. But it took weeks of stress and lawyer calls to clear it up, all because he answered a few friendly questions from a friendly officer. Here's what I want you to take away from all of this. The 3 questions. Where are you coming from? Do you know why I pulled you over? And is there anything I should know about? Are not just conversation. They're tools, they're techniques. They're part of a system that's designed to gather information, and that system doesn't distinguish between guilty people and innocent people. It just collects data and lets the data do what it does. You have the right to not provide that data. You have the right to remain silent. You have the right to ask for an attorney. And exercising those rights doesn't make you guilty. It makes you smart. It makes you protected. It makes you someone who understands that the legal system is a system, and systems have rules, and the rules exist to protect everyone, including you. Now, I want to hear from you. I've shared a lot of information here, a lot of stories, a lot of warnings. But what I really want to know is what you've experienced. Have you ever been asked these questions? How did you respond? Did you walk away feeling good about the interaction, or did you have that nagging feeling that maybe you said too much? Drop your stories in the comments. I read every single one, and I want to know what's happening out there, what you're dealing with, what questions you're being asked. Your experiences help me understand what travelers really need to know, and they help other people in the comments learn from what you've been through. And here's something to think about as you go about your day, as you travel, as you drive, as you go through life. The next time someone in uniform asks you a friendly question, pause for just a second before you answer. Think about what they're really asking. Think about where that information might go. Think about whether you really need to answer, or whether this might be one of those moments where silence is not just golden, but protective. You don't have to be rude. You don't have to be confrontational. You just have to be smart. And being smart means knowing when to speak and when to stay quiet. I've been doing this work for a long time now, studying travel law, talking to lawyers, talking to officers, talking to people who've been through the system. And if there's one thing I've learned, it's that the people who regret their interactions with police almost always regret saying too much, not too little. I've never met anyone who wished they'd talked more, but I've met plenty who wished they'd kept their mouth shut. So keep that in mind the next time you're at the airport. The next time those flashing lights appear in your rearview mirror, the next time a friendly officer approaches you with what seems like just a casual question, you have rights. You have options. You have the power to protect yourself. Use it. And don't forget to drop a comment and let me know what you think. Have you ever been in this situation? What did you do? What would you do differently now? I really want to know, because this conversation isn't over. It's just beginning, and your voice is part of it. So comment below, share your stories, ask your questions. Let's keep talking about this, because the more we talk, the more we learn, and the more we learn, the safer we all become. Safe travels, everyone. And remember, sometimes the smartest thing you can say is nothing at all.